countdown on the screen?
Yep.
4, 3, 2, 1. Opening on out.
Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and I'd like to welcome you to another live stream from our studios here. Today's live stream is going to be very unique. The topic is going to be unique, and the guests that are joining me also are going to be unique. And the performance of this particular live stream is, as always, going to be unique, since it's going to be a combination of a video live stream and at the same time our radio podcast, Let Us Reason. With that in mind, I want to start our podcast, Let Us Reason, right now. So I want to welcome those who are joining us into this podcast, Let Us Reason. When you are listening to this, I want you to be aware of the fact that I am in studio. We're doing a video live stream that you can later, if you like, go and watch on our YouTube channel, Sira International, or if you are one of our friends on my Facebook page, alfadi.sira. You can even go and watch it on Fonder Films, which is the website or the YouTube channel for Dr. J. Smith, who happen to be here with me. So I want to welcome two distinguished guests to address a topic. We want to call it the search for Muhammad, or let's say, did Muhammad exist, in honor of a book written by my other guest. First, I want to welcome Dr. J. Smith. Dr. J., thank you so much for joining me here today.
Well, thank you. This is quite an auspicious year, isn't it? 2020. What's happened this year with just this question? Did Muhammad exist? Right. We would not even be asking this question had not Robert Spencer gone ahead and written a book 8 years ago introducing that question. Gobsmacked everybody, because
exactly.
no one would dare ask that question except Robert Spencer.
And here's the book that Dr. J is talking about, and I'm going to put it right here in front of the camera. And because of this, we decided to bring no other than Robert Spencer. So Robert, thank you so much for taking the time, brother, to be here with us to discuss not only the first edition, but I believe you're working on a second edition right now.
Yes, that's right. It's revised and significantly expanded, and it will be out sometime next year. I'm hoping sooner rather than later, but right now it's available at Amazon for pre-order, and the publication date is listed as July, which seems to me to be hundreds of years away in my mind, since the book is done now. And I think even people who've read the first book will find quite a lot that's new and surprising in the new edition.
Yeah, and when you say July, of course, for the sake of the audience, July of 2021. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So,
thank God, 22 or 4 or 6.
Yeah. So, Robert, I want to start with you. And by the way, because it's a live stream, we may get some comments or questions for both of you, by the way. So I'll share those with you when appropriate. Robert, let me ask you, what prompted you to write a book with this title back in 2012, I believe, which probably would have been so hostile, to write something like this at that time?
There were a couple of things. One was I wrote a biography of Muhammad called The Truth About Muhammad, which was published in 2006. And it's based, for the most part, upon the Sirat Rasulullah of Ibn Ishaq, or through the recension of Ibn Hisham, and also, of course, upon the biographical material that's in Bukhari and Muslim and the other primary hadith collections. Now, when I was working on that book, of course, it became clear immediately that this was all late material. Even the earliest material was quite a bit removed, over a century removed from the time that it was all supposed to happen. But it was the earliest available material, and so that's what I used for the biography. In any case, The Truth About Muhammad is designed to show what Muslims believe about their prophet. And that, of course, is a matter that is still important today because it motivates jihad terrorists and elucidates a great deal of the behavior of Muslims around the world, in Sharia states in particular, and so on. But in working on that book, I ended up with quite a few questions about the historicity of the material, and there's a brief section in that book, The Truth About Muhammad, saying that it might be that none of this is historically accurate. Then I was speaking in The Hague at a conference where Ibn Warraq, the great scholar of Islam, was also speaking. And he and I met up by chance on a street in The Hague, walking around the city, just looking around at the sites, and ended up having a very extensive conversation about the historical Muhammad, which made me think that there was a great deal more about this issue that people did not realize. And I thought that what was needed was a popular handbook that is not a scholarly tome, but something that would be readable for somebody who was not well versed in the material, that would introduce people to the difficulties in the canonical story of the origins of Islam. And so that's Did Muhammad Exist?
Yep, thank you for explaining that. And I know there is a fabulous section in your book called The Man Who Wasn't There. And in there, you really ask the right questions, and you point out to the fact that the name Muhammad, at least if you look at the Quran, was mentioned 4 times, with at least, like you mentioned, 3 of those could be a title, versus the names of Moses and Abraham and others, not to mention other outside sources. Now, Jay, lead us into your own research now. Now, you're taking this topic to a whole different level.
Some of you know who they are because of the countries they exist. But these are guys and gals. There's one gal and about 5 different guys who are actually have been for the last 20 years. This is not something new. They have been going back to the original sources. That means they've been going back to the Aramaic. They've been going back to the Nabatean sources. They've been going back to the historical sources from the 7th century, because they distrust everything that's coming out of the 8th and 9th century. So the 9th and 10th century. Did I say 8th and 9th? Remember what Robert Spencer just said. Ibn Ishaq, that is 8th century, but Robert, am I correct that Ibn Ishaq, we don't have any of his material, do we?
Right, Ibn Hisham, he copied huge portions of Ibn Ishaq in the 9th century.
And here's the book right here.
Farther removed, and that's what that is.
Here's the book right here.
That is translated by Alfred Guillaume is Ibn Hisham's biography of Muhammad, based on Ibn Ishaq. But we have no idea, we have no way of knowing what Ibn Hisham did with the material he got from Ibn Ishaq. So we can't really say it's 8th century. Strictly speaking, it's 9th century, like the Hadith material.
Yeah. I've got the book right here, and even if you look at the cover, it says the translation of Ibn Ishaq Siratu Rasulullah. That is a lie, is it not? And this is something that we've all tied into. We've all fallen into. And I had to laugh when I saw this, that they had to print this. Even you said Ibn Ishaq when you quickly corrected yourself. I mean Ibn Hisham. All of this comes from Ibn Hisham from 833. That's 200 years after Muhammad. And so that's why this group of scholars are going back to the 7th century. They're fed up with this idea that we have to go to the 9th and 10th century, to Ibn Hisham, al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, al-Babari. They're fed up with this because that is too late. They're 200 to 300 years later, and they're all too far north. Now they're going back to what every historian should do. They're going back to the 7th century, to the time period that supposedly Muhammad lived, and they're looking at the evidence on the ground. Isn't that what you did, Robert?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where you get to what Al-Fadi mentioned, that there's nothing there. There's nobody there. There's no Muhammad. There are a couple of mentions of the word Muhammad that have no content, just like the 4 mentions that you referred to in the Quran of the word Muhammad. They don't have any biographical material in the Quran at all about who this was.
Well, we think we know who it was, actually. We do know a guy named Muhammad. That's his nickname. His real name is Ilyas ibn Qabisa from Tayyiye. This fellow did exist from the 7th century, but he did not exist in Mecca and Medina. He was nowhere that far south. He came from Hira, which is today Kufa, which is near Baghdad, which is today Iraq. Now, it wasn't called that back then. It was called Ctesiphon. And that is hundreds of miles further north. And interestingly, this guy, his nickname was Muhammad. That was what he used, and this guy lived, he was a Christian. He was not a Muslim.
Right, and I want to play the devil's advocate here and ask these tough questions. You know, we are assuming Muhammad didn't exist, at least the way Islam presented him, and therefore we're following the evidence and the discoveries. Now, you mention a person who happened to be north, who happened to be in an area called Hira, connect that to Ghar Hira, the cave of Hira in Mecca, and who happened to be called Muhammad. Coincidence? I'm not really so sure about that, but you can see where we're headed with all of this right now. And you can see why Dr. J, for instance, have every right to bring these things to the forefront. You can see why Robert Spencer had every right to write a book, first edition, and now even, as he mentioned earlier, adding more material to it. And probably you're going to end up doing a third edition by the time we're done here today, because there is so much out there that hasn't been addressed. Now, folks in the control room, I saw a comment from a person by the name Adnan al-Sha'iri, Sha'ir, I think. And Adnan al-Sha'ir saying that you, Jay, have embarrassed yourself when you said that Muhammad didn't exist. So I'm going to give Adnan a chance between now and the conclusion of this particular live stream to go ahead and present us with a single evidence that Muhammad existed. And I need an evidence from the 7th century. One single evidence. That's all we're asking for.
About 2 weeks ago, I had a debate with David Wood on this very subject. And David Wood was going to say that he took the position, and he even turned towards the camera and says, Muslims, I'm on your side on this debate. Help me out. Give me some support, because I'm going to prove that Muhammad did exist. Jay's going to say he did not exist. In 2 hours of debating, I kept on asking, coming back to David Wood, can you show me one piece of evidence? Can you show me one artifact? Can you show me one rock inscription? Can you show me one coin? Can you show me any artifact, anything that you can show me that has his name on it that's from the 7th century? Don't tell me what's from the 9th century redacted back on the 7th century. Don't go to the Ashtanami letter, which comes from the 16th century that's redacted back. I don't want anything from the 9th, 10th, 16th century. I want from the 7th century. In 2 hours, he could not come up with one piece of evidence. And this is what we're asking Muslims. So if Adnan says that he did exist, where is that piece of evidence? Show me one reference, not just Muhammad, show me a reference for Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, or Ali, the first 4 caliphs. Their names exist, but they're not caliphs. Those are very popular names. Muhammad's name is a very popular name. The praised one. Even Abdul Malik refers to himself as the praised one. And that's why he's there on the coins. That's why he's there on the Dome of the Rock. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for a man named Muhammad who lived in Mecca and Medina, as the traditions tell us, who grew up in Mecca, was born in Mecca in 570, moved to Medina in 622. We want that Muhammad from the 9th century. Show us any reference to his name, any reference that he was the one that received a book called the Quran, any reference that he lived in a place called Mecca, even a reference for a city called Mecca from the 7th century, any reference that there is a people called Muslims, and any reference that there's a religion called Islam. Those 5 things from the 7th century. Show us an inscription. Show us a coin. Show us something from the 7th century. Otherwise, would you stop this idea that we're lying? We at least have the evidence. And remember, all the time we've always been said, and every time that I've done this debate, I did this debate at the very beginning in 1995 with Dr. Jamal Badawi. His only comeback is, you're arguing from silence.
Yeah.
This is now 25 years later, and I'm saying, I'm not arguing from silence. I have the evidence. Where is your evidence? You are arguing from silence. Until you can show us this man, Muhammad, from the 7th century, everything you're going to throw at us is 200 to 300 and even 800 years later, and we're fed up. We're not going to do just that, because he's now updated it since 2012. Right. Am I correct, Robert? You've now updated it. Tell us some things that you have updated. Give us a little precursor as to where you're going with this.
And before even that, brother, I want to give people, what would they read, or what are the sections in that book that you feel like could be powerful, and then what are the updates?
Well, for one thing, I answered, this is in the original book, I answered David Wood's argument. His primary argument in his debate with Jay just a few weeks ago, and his debate with me on this issue when the book first came out in 2012, his primary argument was the criterion of embarrassment, it's called. Right. And that is the idea that Muslims would not invent stories that make their prophet look bad if they're inventing a prophet for themselves. And that makes a lot of sense to people. And I find that people, that's their primary objection that they have to this. And the answer to it is, of course, that we are not in the same worldview that they had. We do not have that worldview today. And so a lot of the things that embarrass us today did not embarrass and would not embarrass the people who put these stories together. And so Muhammad's child bride, his marriage to his former daughter-in-law, the disgusting things like the semen stains on his clothes, all these things are designed to show his power, his strength, his virility. And they embarrass us, but they didn't embarrass the people of the time. And I could go on and on with examples of that kind of thing, but that in general demonstrates the hollowness of the argument, that really it's based on a kind of chronological snobbery, ethnocentrism of the timepiece, that David is bringing 21st century morals and Christian understanding of morality to the people who put this material together in the 9th century. And they had a very different way of looking at the world. New in the book this time are Dan Gibson's groundbreaking discoveries regarding the Qibla, the direction for prayer, showing that the earliest mosques faced Petra in Jordan and not Mecca at all. And this corresponds to Patricia Crona's determination back in the 70s that Mecca was not in Mecca, but was much farther north. That is the Mecca to which Muslims referred in the earliest days.
Right.
And the manuscripts also of the early Qurans. Actually, one of the impetuses that I had to write a revised and expanded edition of this book, besides all the discoveries that have been made, like the material around Petra, since I wrote the first edition, was primarily that people started writing me a few years ago when there were some manuscripts of the Quran, or purportedly of the Quran, discovered that were dated to between 570 and 645. And Muslims were actually writing me, quite a few for a while, saying, are you going to withdraw your book now? It's been proven now that the Quran comes from the time of Muhammad. So are you going to apologize for did Muhammad exist and put it out of print? And I looked at the new discoveries and I thought that's just the opposite of what I'm going to do, because the new discoveries, if the carbon dating shows that these manuscripts come from 570, possibly up till 610, then they come before Muhammad.
Right.
In which case they are probably source documents or fragments of source documents that were used to put the Quran together.
They're the Q document.
I'm sorry?
They are the Q document.
Yes. They show exactly the opposite. The sources of the Quran, the Kavella, the Q document, rather than the Quran itself. Because obviously, if Muhammad is real and these things happened as the canonical Islamic sources say they did, then we wouldn't expect any Quranic material to actually predate Muhammad, and
That's
so
right.
it doesn't make any sense.
That's right. Well, we have about 5 minutes, give or take, before this podcast ends, and then we'll jump to the next one. In the next part, of course, I want to start asking both of you about the evidence. Maybe each one of you will share one evidence about why you should doubt the existence of Muhammad according to the traditional view. So, Jay, what would you like to add to this?
Well, goodness, I have 25 pieces that I could give to you right now. I gave 25 there to David Wood in that debate. I'll wait for the next episode, but I want to just carry off from what Robert was saying here. He's referring to the Birmingham Folios, which is just 2 pieces of paper, front and back. There's only about 30 to 33 verses in there. How many verses are there in the Quran? There's over 6,000. So we're talking about a very small segment. And take a look at what's in those, that Surah 18, parts of Surah 19, and parts of Surah 20. Not even the entire surahs, just bits and pieces. And it's interesting, the bits and pieces that are on the Birmingham Folio are from exactly what Robert's talking about. This is about the story of the story of Ephesus, the sleepers in Ephesus, which comes from the 4th century and actually can be dated back to the 2nd century. The story that comes from James the Lesser, and also the story of Moses, which would come straight out of the Bible from 1400 BC. So these are all stories that would have predated the Quran. They predate Muhammad. They predate Islam. But if you're going to use radiocarbon dating, be careful of radiocarbon dating. It's going to shoot you in the foot. Because remember, they are now radiocarbon dating the Sanaa manuscript, and the radiocarbon dating from 4 different labs, including the one in Oxford, including the one in Kiel, which is Germany, also in Lyon in France, and also the one in Zurich that is in Switzerland. Those 4 carbon datings of the Sanaa manuscript go back from 460 up until, listen to the date, 550. So that is that's over 100 years before even Muhammad even existed. Are you going to go with those carbon datings? And so you need to be careful about carbon datings. They are very inexact, and they only tell you the date that the animal died on the paper. They do not tell you when the ink was written. And you have no idea, you cannot date the ink. So this is the problem that Muslims are coming up with. They jump on the story. You notice when that came out in BBC in 2015, all the Muslims came down to Speaker's Corner. They hammered us with this. Notice none of the Muslim scholars said anything. anything about it, because 568 to 645, that not only predates Muhammad's birth, as you're saying, the median date would be around 610. That would mean it's before the Quran was even starting to be introduced, because it's 610, so according to the traditions, that Muhammad started receiving his revelation. And if it ends, the latest date is 645. That's 7 years before Uthman finally wrote it down in his canonical form. So that predates even the canon of the Quran. So you see, be careful of using that kind of proof text. As Robert said, this would make sense if it is proto-material that has been borrowed. Much of the Quran has been borrowed. And this is why Muslims don't want to admit. We know that a lot of the stories of all the biblical characters in chapter 5, verse 31 and 32 of Cain and Abel, that comes from the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, written in the 2nd century. You know the story of of Abraham there in Mecca in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71. What Abraham is doing in Mecca, I have no idea, even though the word is not Mecca. And that comes from the Mishnah of Rabbah, written in the 2nd century again. The story of Solomon and Sheba in chapter 27, verse 17 to 44. That's the story of Solomon and Sheba. That's not in my Bible. I would love that story in Sunday school, but that comes from the 2nd Targum of Esther. Again, these are 2nd century apocryphal accounts. They were written long before any Quran would have been put together. They were incorporated into the Quran, lifted them in there, and they are not the same stories in our Bible, because these are nothing more than folk tales. These are bedtime tales. And that's what the Quran is made of. It borrows from all over the world. And Robert is exactly right. If you want to look at the carbon dating, you can run with it if you want to. Be careful. It's going to shoot you in the foot, because you're going to just prove what we've been saying all along. Much of the Quran has been borrowed from these earlier sources.
That's
nothing
right.
more, nothing less.
Amen. And we have about 2 minutes. I'll get back to you guys. Adnan Al-Shair, looks like you changed the way your name is written, and I can see that you are just coming with a different account right now, making claim that we blocked you. You know, I ask you a question. Give me one source to prove that Muhammad existed in the 7th century. And now you're saying you like to watch our shows so your faith is strengthened. Why are you here if your faith is strong already? Ask yourself that question. So, Robert, within the next 2 minutes, just give us maybe 1 minute for you, 1 minute for Jay. Give us a quick recap why this topic is important.
Well, obviously, you just touched on it with Adnan, that it matters for Islamic faith. And the Islamic faith teaches people to do evil things. It is the quintessential example of the prophet Isaiah's words about woe to those who do evil, call good evil and evil good. And so it is incumbent upon us as Christians, and incumbent upon all people of goodwill for that matter, to expose the falsity of this ideology and to try to lead people out of it. That's why this is so important. And you know, Adnan, I understand where he's coming from. It's a kind of sleight of hand that's been put over on the whole world, and particularly on Muslims in regard to this. I can tell you I'm working on the next book after Did Muhammad Exist Now? And it's a critical edition of the Quran, the whole Quran with commentary that I'm getting from the primary Sunni tafsir and the commentaries on the Quran. And I'm going through the text now and standardizing how I'm going to present the Quran text in this book. And I am using we're referring to older translations, and they almost all of them say this, O Muhammad, say Muhammad, tell the people of the book Muhammad, and all those Muhammads are added in.
That's right.
As you noted at the beginning, the word Muhammad only appears 4 times in the actual Quran, but a guy like Adnan is going to read the Quran and think Muhammad is being referred to all the time.
That's right.
Because this is how, even if it's not written in the Arabic, it's how it's understood by Muslims, that all these things that are addressed to people are directed at Muhammad. And so they think Muhammad's all over the place in this book.
That's
and
right.
It's a trick. He's not there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jay, we'll pick it up next time. So I want to conclude this podcast. Let us reason. Thank you so much for joining us, of course. Those of you who are watching this live, please stay where you at. We're not really finishing yet. We're going to take just about a minute break. We're going to jump into the second part of this podcast. And when we come on the other side of this, I'll ask Jay the same question. Thank you again for joining us here, and hopefully you're enjoying this podcast if you're listening to it, and hopefully if you are watching it that you are enjoying this interaction. We encourage you, of course, to write questions for us, and we will address those before the conclusion of the second part. This is Al-Fadi, over and out. And yes, I know this is Jay's word, but I took it from him.
How dare you?
File a suit,
It's
my
called
friend.
plagiarism at its worst.
File a suit.
I will. Demand
You are
you pay for
Tom,
that.
too.
That I own that, by the way.
Guy is narcissist. He went and registered this.
No, I didn't do it. My team did. Actually, not that one. It's the Book and the Man. They've registered for me. I've got that copyrighted now.
Yeah, now I say the man in the book.
I know. That's just change it around and try to make it your own.
So in the next part, Robert, I'll ask you to throw in a couple of evidence, that you came across that compelled you to basically address as evidence to show that really Muhammad, as we know him, didn't exist, at least in that time frame. And I'll do the same thing
Okay.
with you. Yeah. Okay, guys, I'm ready to start again. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of this podcast, Let Us Reason. We are going to start now part 2 of this podcast about the question, did Muhammad exist? Or better yet, the search for Muhammad, as Dr. J. Smith calls it. Of course, Did Muhammad Exist is named after a book that our dear brother Robert Spencer, who is our guest also here in studio, ended up writing, and I'm showing it to you if you are watching this right now. And he is doing the second edition, which supposedly going to come out in July of 2021. Right now, we're doing this in December of 2020, just for a point of reference for those of you who are watching this. Now, I concluded part 1 by asking Robert an important question. Why is this topic important? And he, of course, shared with us why it would be important, especially for our Muslim friends, for instance. Jay, I'll ask you the same question. Why is the search for Muhammad important?
I'm just watching the people who are watching this, and I see Adnan's not there anymore. He's kind of left. I think we pretty much shut him down, and this is the difficulty for people like Adnan. Remember, he said, "You have just strengthened my faith by listening to what you're saying." That's the public face of Islam. Privately, you can see there's a real problem here, and this is it. For anybody who is a Muslim who has been told since they were knee-high to a grasshopper that Muhammad was born in 570, died in 632, but between 610 and 632 he received this book called the Quran, that 22-year period. And if you have been told that this is the greatest of all prophets and that he lived in a place called Mecca, that no one is superior to him, he's the seal of all the prophets, and because of what he did and said, we have to do, and we have to follow as his example what we're to say and do. Now, we would say as Christians, we have the same thing with Jesus Christ. So we understand that. We understand that he is our model, and he did live in the first century. Here's the difficulty. We are now showing that everything they know about this man, everything they know about what he said and did, comes from 200 to 300 years later, as we saw in the last episode. Nothing comes before 833 about this man or about what he said and did. Now, if that is the case, put ourselves in their shoes as Christians. Can you imagine us trying to defend Jesus Christ, or even understanding who he is, what he said and did, if everything that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John said in Paul's letters and all that, right? Remember that Matthew and John were eyewitnesses to what he said and did, so Mark and Luke got it from the eyewitnesses. If everything we knew about this person, Jesus Christ, where he was born, what he did, how he lived, how he died, and how he rose again, if everything came from the 3rd century, we have nothing from the 1st century, what would that do to our faith? What would that do to everything we believe? We would have to throw him out the window. How would we defend him? And yet we know there are lots of sources for Jesus Christ. We know that he is well written about, not just by the gospel writers. We know that we have hostile writings from historians like Thallus and Phlegon, who were referring to his death on the cross, and they mentioned about the fact that when he died, the earth shook and the sun went dark. They did that in 52 AD. Jesus died in 33 AD. These are Greek philosophers who are debating this 20 years after Christ's death. They had nothing to do with Christianity. They would be the last at all to admit or suggest that he didn't exist if he did. And then you have Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, who not only talks about the death of Jesus, he says it happened during under the auspices of Tiberius, under Pontius Pilate. So that's why we know it's 33 AD. He hated Christians. Why would he admit that something if he hated them so much? You have Josephus, who writes about it at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, about the death of Jesus. He's writing in Rome. So there you have Greek, you have Roman, and you have Jewish historians. They are not Christians, who are writing about the event and the person and also the death of Jesus Christ. proving that this is a historical fact. Thank God we have extra biblical references as well as the biblical references. Now we're showing from Muhammad there is nothing of the sort. There is no one that speaks about this man from anywhere. No hostile sources, and we can't even find internal sources. Not for 200 to 300 years. That is why we're bringing this up. I would destroy my faith, and I can see why Adad has had to go off. Because how could you come back on that?
Well, Adnan came back with a powerful refutation, 3 smiley faces. That's all he can come up with.
And that's the public face right there.
Exactly.
But this is the thing, is we're finding now Muslims are leaving Islam. We're seeing them happen here in 2020.
Yeah.
They're leaving Islam for 2 things that have happened in 2020. One is the whole difficulty of the Qira'at and the fact that there is not any preserved Quran, and that was that interview that happened on June 8th. And the other is this new material that Robert Spencer introduced in 2012. When I say introduced, there were others that introduced before him, but he introduced it popularly, and that's why it's now all over the world. And we want to thank you, Robert. Thank God you did that. Thank God you were brave enough to do that. Thank you, God, we were courageous enough to do that, and we're now living off of your shoulders, you might say. You went and forged it, and we're benefiting from it. God bless you.
And I have to say this, Robert, the first time you did that, and I watched that debate between you and David, of course, and I took the debate as, okay, these are 2 friends just making fun of this whole thing. And personally, because I've been programmed to believe that Muhammad existed in the exact time frame that Islam taught me growing up in Saudi, I had a hard time actually accepting your argument. But today I look back and I say, wow, you set a groundbreaking, basically, foundation for what is to come. And look at us, 2012, 2020 now, and we are talking about it, and it appears to be more and more viable argument because everything points north. Everything points to a different character. We have a person here that sends his regards to you, by the way, Jay. His name is Zubair Al-Muhajir, and he says he can prove that Muhammad existed. So Zubair, you have 18 minutes left for this part. I want you to go ahead and list maybe 2 arguments. Just tell us why you believe Muhammad existed.
From the 7th century.
Remember, it's the 7th century. And then Zubair, if you prove to me that you are capable of doing this, we're gonna invite you to debate Jay on my channel. There you go, man. I'm extending an invitation to you already. In fact, we'll bring in Robert also just for kicks and giggles. He will be there too. So go ahead. You have 18 minutes, 2 arguments. Muhammad existed in the 7th century. So, Robert, give us one example of an evidence you use in your book to really argue against the existence of Muhammad.
Well, Jay articulated it so well just now. I think the primary argument that is in Did Muhammad Exist is his absence. And this is much more than, as Jamal Badawi claimed, an argument from silence. It's much more than that, because you have to think about it in terms of what we would reasonably expect if Muhammad, as the prophet of Islam, had existed and lived between 570 and 632 and gotten revelations from Gabriel from 610 to 632, and that those all existed. They would have to all have existed at the time of his death, along with all of the hadith literature regarding his words and deeds. And so that's an extraordinarily huge body of literature that we are supposed to believe existed and was an oral tradition and motivated these people. It's not even that it's oral tradition that makes it difficult to believe, because people did have prodigious memories in those days, and days before writing implements and paper were easy to get and printing was invented. Most people had in their minds, they had memorized what they had to remember, what they had to know. And so it's possible that all this was an oral tradition. That's fine. But the difficulty comes when the Arab conquests begin. And you have the Arabs conquering Egypt, conquering the rest of North Africa, conquering Syria and the Middle East, Iran, going into India, and going into Spain. By 732, the Arab empire stretched from Spain to India, all across North Africa and the Middle East and Persia. And that is from 632 to 732, all that conquest happened. And according to the standard Islamic story, it all was motivated by the life of Muhammad, the teachings of the Quran, and the teachings of Muhammad himself in making war against and subjugating unbelievers, as we can read in the Quran to this day. And yet in all of that expanse, in all of that time, 100 years of conquest, and voluminous literature written by the conquered people as to what happened, and particularly the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronius, in late 630s, writing about the terrible things that had befallen the Christians of Jerusalem and being conquered by the Saracens. Nowhere does Sophronius or anybody else mention that these people said they had a new prophet or a new holy book or a new religion. Now that's extraordinary. If that's supposed to be the whole motivating impetus for all of this conquest, that they never mentioned it, that's not just an argument from silence.
That's right.
That calls for an explanation. And the absence of Islam and the absence of Muhammad and the Quran in that context is particularly glaring and absolutely inexplicable if Muhammad actually existed.
Hoyland, in his work, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, made reference to these things. And here's the book. I encourage everyone to get this book in your library. This is an amazing book.
There's a thing about that. Excuse me, I have to say, Robert Hoyland presses his issue by translating, when they say Tayyeye and Saracens, he translates it as Muslims. And he gives the impression that the early material speaks much more about Muslims and Islam than it actually does. And that's the key issue that we're disputing. And so Hoyland is useful for collecting all the earliest documents together. But one has to know that sometimes his translations are not accurate. And they are not accurate in favor of...
It's a great point you're bringing, Robert. This is what me and Jay have been wrestling with, is like the field of academia has the data, but yet sadly they water it down for whatever reason sometimes.
It's called dimitude.
Yeah.
It's called dimitude.
Yeah. So Jay, bouncing back to you. You said you have 25 reasons, and you and I are going to be doing an entire series on that. Give us one reason why Muhammad, in your case, also supports what Robert is stating, didn't exist, or at least the Muhammad that Muslims know did not exist really in the time frame that they're mentioning.
There are two probably the best that we can go to, and I'm just going to go right back to the 7th century, and I'm going to go in and ask, what do we now have in the 7th century? We have coins and we have rock inscriptions. Those are brilliant because coins and rock inscriptions don't deteriorate, they don't disintegrate. They're as good today as the day they were minted before the coins and as they were chiseled for the rock inscriptions. When you look at the coins were being minted in Syria and they're being minted in Iran. So Syria in the west and Iran in the east. When you look at these two different mints, they're being minted in the 7th century. So they're being minted by them. If they were Muslims, they would now control those mints, because remember, by the time Muawiyah comes to power, after the rightly guided caliph, all the way from Afghanistan in the east and all the way to Tripoli in the west was under their jurisdiction, which included these mints. Now, what is the first thing you do? If you are Abu Bakr or Umar or Uthman or Ali, the first thing you do as a caliph, you have to get your name out there, and you have mints. You are now creating new coins. These coins are being created the same time periods that they were reigning. The first thing you do is you put your name on that mint, and you put your face on that mint, and you put something about what religion you belong to. That's how you announce yourself to all your people, because you don't have newspapers, you don't have radio, you don't have internet, you don't have TV in the 7th century, but you do have coins. And so you then disperse those coins to the whole populace, so they now know who's now in charge across this whole swath of land. Those coins exist. We are looking at them. And in every one of those coins, there's an image. Now stop and think. Can any Muslim leader have an image of themselves on a coin? Absolutely not. That goes against the traditions. But whose name is on there? Abu Bakr's name, Uthman, Ali, any of these names? No, they are not in there. They are completely different names, and what's most important, those in the West, that's what's interesting, those in the West are all Christians. They are holding crosses. They have crosses above their heads. In the East, they're all Zoroastrian. That means that they have the fire altar on the back of the coins. Let's get to Muawiyah, because there we get a name that we recognize. Muawiyah comes to power in 661. He mints coins and he disperses them all over his empire.
Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Right?
You say it much better than I do. And there's the guy that we're looking at. I'll let you say it so I don't embarrass myself.
I'll teach it for free. No worries.
It's not going to cost him any coins on this. But here we go. He puts his image on it right there. And over in the West, his coins have crosses. In the East, his coins have fire altars, proving that he's basically placating the people from his different religions. But there's from his different areas of his reign. But there's nothing Islamic about any of these coins. And this continues all the way up until 680. And when the Mudwinids come to power, and Abd Marwan, whose son is Abdul Malik, he comes to power in 685, and it's not till 692 that the coins finally have anything to do with Islam. Now, something would say Zubair in 687 or 685 has some one that's earlier. Nonetheless, it's under the auspices, under the authority of Abdul Malik. The earliest coin that we see as Islamic is not till 692. Muhammad died in 632. That's 60 years too late. So the coins, you just follow the sequence of the coins, and you can see the sequence. I don't have time to go into it, how they show that they are either Christians or they're Zoroastrian, but they are not Muslim. Now let's go to the rock inscriptions. All the rock inscriptions, 30,000 of them have been discovered. Almost all of them are in the north. None of them are from Mecca and Medina. And they're written in what we know as Nabatean Aramaic. They are not written in Sabaic, which is the Arabic that would have been used in Mecca and Medina, in the Hijaz. Isn't that interesting? They're written in this Nabatean Aramaic, and what's fascinating about it, Lindstedt, who has done a study looking from 640 up to 740, he noticed that all the coins prior to 690, 690, again, that's Abdul Malik. Anything before Abdul Malik, no reference anything about a man named Muhammad, no reference to any city called Mecca, no reference to any people called Muslims, no reference to a religion called Islam, and no reference to any Quranic material at all. From anything, all of these thousands upon thousands of inscriptions prior to 690. From 690 on, suddenly Muhammad's name starts to be introduced. Then you start to see these formulas. Then you start to see the word Muslim come in. Then you start to see by Islam. Finally, Muhammad takes on a character as a prophet in 730. 730, that's 100 years after Muhammad. And finally, you see from 730 on, he not only takes an image as a prophet, then you start getting these different practices like we know as the five practice, the prayers, and the shahada, and also the Ramadan fast. That is introduced in 730 to 740. Look at the sequence on the inscriptions, look at the sequence on the coins, and you can see how Islam evolved and how Muhammad evolved. And that's why that is 7th century material that Muslims have not talked about, they have not gone to. I'm just giving you 2 of 25 that I could go to right now, but I think that will be enough because I see I'm going to run out of time.
That's not a problem because we want to give Robert also a chance to interject here. Any other thoughts, Robert, based on what Jay maybe mentioned, or anything you can add?
We can talk about this all day, but a couple things that I think could be well elucidated is the fact that, one thing about it, the question here is that people, of course, will have different interpretations of the available data. So a very negative review of Did Muhammad Exist, the first edition, years ago, when I was talking about Muawiyah in the book and the crosses on the coins, they said, well, you know, the early Muslim rulers, they had a very light touch. And they didn't interfere with the religious practices of the non-Muslim people they conquered. And people probably believe that somewhere, but it warrants being said that Islam has never had a light touch historically when it conquers non-Muslim people. Never. And never been charitable or generous toward the non-Muslim religious practices, which it is sharply restricted everywhere in the world, as another one of my books, The History of Jihad, shows in detail. And also, we have to remember that Muhammad said that Jesus, the prophet of Islam, Jesus, was going to come back and break the cross because the Quran says that Jesus was not killed or crucified. And it's an insult to Allah to say that one of his prophets would be crucified. So if Muawiyah is a pious Muslim and knows all this, then the last thing he would do is put a cross on the coins. Also, there are Islamic traditions that completely contradict the canonical account, and yet they're Islamic traditions, and this also has to be explained. For example, Abdul Malik is recorded as having said, I am afraid I'm going to die during Ramadan because I was born during Ramadan, I became caliph during Ramadan, and so I collected the Quran during Ramadan. Now, if Uthman collected the Quran 40 years before Abdul Malik, then why is Abdul Malik saying he collected the Quran? It would make sense if Abdul Malik actually collected the Quran, or began to, and he attributes his work to Uthman to give it an air of age and authenticity.
That's right, going backwards.
Right, but it wouldn't make any sense if everybody knew that Uthman had collected the Quran and the Muslims all had the Quran for 40 years before Abdul Malik. Why would Abdul Malik say such a thing? And it's the same thing in exactly the same way. There is another Islamic tradition in which an old man, an old Muslim, says, we never read the Quran in the mosques until the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. which is
Right.
the same time as Abdul Malik.
Exactly.
Now, if the Quran was collected at the time of Uthman and distributed everywhere, then the Muslims had been reading the Quran for 40 years in the mosques before Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. But if the Quran just started to be compiled as the Quran from earlier existing material at the time of Abdul Malik and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, then it would make perfect sense for this old man to say this.
Right.
And the thing was that it was retrojected back so as to make people accept it. And they couldn't go and Google and find out what was really going on 40 years before.
And that explains also, and this is what I want to interject something about the qira'at, or the readings, variant readings. That explains why when it became now an official religious book to be read, everyone began to spread it the way they assumed it to be read as, or have their own version of it. And now you have so many different readings. I thought Uthman controlled that earlier, didn't he?
You're coming in, you're getting into a whole new can of worms. You really want to get into the Qur'an? You really want to get into that? The other thing that has destroyed Islam just this year? You want to get into both of them into this segment.
That
We only
will be
have
for
4
next
minutes
year.
to go.
That will
And
be
you want
for
to
next
open
year.
that can of worms now? Listen, look what Yasser Qadi did a week ago when he tried to shut that down. He just sat there and screamed at us, called us all kinds of names, and he thought that would shut it down? Stop and think what you're asking, because if you want to talk about how the Quran was put together, stop and ask this question right now. What kind of Arabic existed in the 7th century in Mecca and Medina? It was Sabaic Arabic. Sabaic Arabic comes from Yemen. That is the Arabic that was used all the way up to Medina. What kind of Arabic do you find in the Quran? Well, you find the Ta'ad Marbuta there. You have the Alak Maksuda there. That is not Sabaic Arabic. That is uniquely Nabatean Aramaic, which comes from Petra. Did we not talk about Petra before? Petra is 600 miles further north. If there had been a Quran that came from the Hijaz from the 7th century when Muhammad was living, if it did come from him when Uthman was actually canonizing it, he would have used Sabaic Arabic. If you're using Sabaic Arabic, it has the 5 dots and the 3 vowels already in, which means there would have been no qira'ats. There would be no reason for having a qira'at because they had all been there to begin with. The fact that there were no dots and there were no vowels in the Aramaic, Nabatean Aramaic up in the north is why you even have the qira'at problem. Because that means that Quran actually is from the north. It was using that Arabic, which could not be read because there's only 16 consonantal letters at that time in the 7th century. The 5 dots and the 3 vowels had to be added in the 8th century, and that's why we now have 30 different Qurans. And good old Yasser Qadi, if he'd just do his own homework, he would have realized that whoever made that decision to use the Nabatean Aramaic did the wrong decision. And that's why I'm just sitting here laughing at it, because it all now is flying all over the world. And you want to bring that up now.
Well, Jay, Yasser Qadi is taking deep dives. He hasn't surfaced back yet. Okay, so let's stop right here. So we have about 2 minutes left. I want to conclude this. Robert, after we conclude, I would like for you to stay with us for a few more minutes. We want to interact with some maybe possible questions or comments that we're going to see. But before we do so, Robert, how can people find you online?
Jihadwatch.org is the news and commentary site that I run that tracks jihad activity all around the world in its various forms. And also, if I write about this issue, it's there, and you can find it in the categories on the right sidebar. I'm at Jihad Watch RS on Twitter. There is a Facebook page for Jihad Watch, but Facebook is so evil now that I doubt you'd be able to even find it. And in any case, the book, Did Muhammad Exist?, is available on Amazon now. The revised and expanded edition, look for that. It has a different cover, and I think it's a much nicer cover. And you can pre-order it now, and it will be delivered to you when it's out, which I hope will be sooner than July, but we'll see if I can convince the publisher of that.
Wonderful. And Jay, as always, where can people find your teachings? Because you've been doing these teachings for a while now about this topic.
Oh, about this topic, this is about 2006. YouTube came out in 2005. I introduced my channel, Fander Films, in 2006. So I've been around for 14 years. Just go up to Fander Films. There's hundreds of videos up there. All this material that we're talking about, in fact, interviews with Robert Spencer, and also unpacking this material from the debate that I had 2 weeks ago, all of that is on Fander Films. That is much more in-depth than what we're doing right now. Those are 2-hour-long videos. Listen, you could please pull down that material. I'm getting lots of requests from people people, they want my PowerPoints. I don't give the PowerPoints out because you can imagine with tens of thousands of people watching these videos, there's no way that I can send that all out. I'd be spending all of my time, and I'm only one person. I don't have a team around me like you have, or I don't know if you have a team around you, Robert, but I'm the only person that does everything that I do. I make my own videos, I do my own research, I upload them, I edit them, and then I have to respond to them. So please, please, I cannot send the PowerPoints to you. You can, if you want to be my students, then I can send the PowerPoints to you.
Absolutely, and we will be doing a lot of teachings on this, myself and Jay, because I really believe in the research and the material that he is presenting, and we know Robert also is always available as a resource. We're thankful that he found the time to be with us. I really admire how you do these updates on a daily basis, Robert. I don't know where you find the time, brother, because you're always updating that site.
Well, I don't do anything else, really. That's basically it. So
yeah, praise the Lord. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us in this podcast, Let Us Reason. For those of you who are watching it live on Facebook and YouTube channel, Sierra International, or even Fonder Films right now, please stay with us because we want to interact with some comments or possible questions. And Robert, if you could stay for a couple of more minutes, that would be great. Okay. This is the conclusion of our podcast. Okay, well, folks, let me know if there is any questions, any particular comments for Robert or for Jay or for Sierra International or myself. I'm looking here to see if we can find anything that is worthy of interactions. Are you planning on writing any other books, Robert, related to any other topics on Islam?
Oh yes, oh yes. Well, like I mentioned actually earlier on, I'm coming out with a book called The Critical Quran, which will include the entirety of the Quran plus notes and commentary based on the principal Sunni tafsir, and also some material that I'm going to get from the sources for Did Muhammad Exist, and to show people that the Quranic text is considerably more fluid than most people assume. That's all going to be in there. And so that'll be out later in 2021, probably around November.
So there are two questions. One I remember by Michelle Design, and Michelle was saying, and I'm gonna get to Kafir Linda also. Michelle Design is saying, and this is to both of you, Robert and Jay, why would Muslims then, or Muslim sources, invent the character of a prophet by the name Muhammad? And I know you addressed this, Jay, to both of you. I mean, who would like to take a question like that?
Go ahead, and then I'll follow you, Robert.
Go ahead, Robert.
In those days, empires were held together by religion. There were no parliaments, there were no constitutions, there was no idea of a shared set of principles other than religious ones to unify an empire. This is why we see in the development of Christianity in the Eastern Roman Empire in particular, the Byzantine Empire, that it was so important for them to formulate the particular teachings of the faith, and that's why the ecumenical councils were held. The ecumenical councils were political acts. They were religious groupings, of course. They were meetings of the bishops, and they were formulating Christian doctrine. But they were political because it was on the basis of that Christian doctrine that the empire was unified. And the heretics suffered various sanctions within the empire. They often left the empire. That's why Arabia and Iraq and Syria were full of Christian heretics, because they had left the Byzantine Empire, not holding to the faith that the Roman emperors had said, this is what we believe and what unifies our polity. Right. And so the Byzantines were Christians, the Persians were Zoroastrians, and when the Arabs amassed their empire, they needed to keep it unified and growing. And so they created this religion in order to do that, to protect and preserve it, and they made it a martial, war-loving religion because they were military men themselves, and they wanted to create the ideological basis by which their empire could grow as well as be preserved.
Right, and I would tend to agree with you that this is one of the primary reasons why religion and polity were involved and mixed together. What about you, Jay? You want to
No,
add to?
let's take that one step further. What
Yeah.
Robert is saying, absolutely important. Now let's go one step further. Let's look and see. You have the Umayyads with Muawiyah coming to power, and he now owns the land all the way from Tripoli to Afghanistan, that whole swath of land. But he doesn't have the background that his cousins from Abraham have, the Christians and Jews. Remember, the Christians and Jews, they have a prophetic line. The Arabs don't. The Ishmaelites, the Hagarins, these are the names they call themselves. They're in the line of Hagar, the line of Ishmael, the Maghreb, the line of Hagar again, and the Muhajirun. These are the words. They don't give themselves Muslim yet. That has not been introduced. So here you have your cousins who are Christians and Jews. They have a prophetic line. They also have a revelation. You don't have this revelation. You don't have the prophetic line. So here you come. By the time Abdul Malik comes to power, they've been in power now for 40 years. Abdul Malik comes to power. He is what we know as the great Arab reformer. And he comes there in Damascus. He's not living in Mecca and Medina like many people think. He's way up in Damascus, 1,200 miles away. And he puts this building called the Dome of the Rock. He builds it right in the middle of Jerusalem. What in the world is going on? Remember what Robert says. This is a political gesture. It's also a theological gesture. Because all of his mosques are facing towards Petra. So why did he put it in Petra? Why didn't he stick it in Damascus? He slapped it right there in Jerusalem, up on the hill, looking down over the Church of the Sepulchre. Why? Because that was the sanctuary for the Byzantine Christianity. It's also the city for the Jews.
Right.
So he's putting his building, the biggest building of his day, the most splendid structure of his day, he slaps it right there, looking down on the Church of the Sepulchre, and then he writes these inscriptions on the inner ambulatories. That's the only original part of the building. And those inscriptions, he writes reference after reference, attacking the person of Jesus Christ. Surah 4, Ayah 171. For God is one. Say not three, for God is one. And he has no son. Who's that attacking? Well, that's attacking the Trinity. It's attacking the divinity of Jesus, and it's attacking his sonship. Then you have Surah 112, where he introduces the Shahada. There's only one God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. But before he puts in there is no associates. That's not part of the Shahada. So that's, again, attacking chapter 5. That's in chapter 5, verse 72 and 75 of the Quran, where God does not have any partners.
Right.
Again, attacking Byzantine Christianity. So he's not only politically making a political statement, he's also making a theological statement. We now have this new religion that's now the man in the box. We now have a prophetic line, but it looks like he's referring to himself when he says, and Muhammad, that means the praised one. He's referring to himself as the praised one is the prophet of God. So he's actually referring to himself. Muawiyah did that earlier on the coins in 661. This is 30 years later, and he's now putting it on not only his coins that he coins, he also puts it on the Dome of the Rock, and he puts it on the Caliphal protocols. So you can see he is making this political statement. He is now making a religious statement. But now that you start making that political statement, you need to have a revelation. And that's why it's his son Al-Malik who starts creating these manuscripts. These manuscripts that we have, like the Topkapi, the Samarkand, the Ma'il, and all these, they all start to appear after 705, after Abdul Malik is out of power. Look at the date. Follow the sequence like you did with the coins, like we did with the rock inscriptions. Look and see what not only the political sequence that's going on, but also the theological sequence that's happening.
Yep, excellent. One last question for you, Robert, and we'll let you go. I'm sorry if we kept you late. This is coming from one of our followers, Kafir Linda Clark. I like the name. She's saying, really, what did the early Muslims call themselves as they were expanding the territories in North Africa, for instance? And I think you did address something to that extent in your book, and I know Jay can respond also on your comment.
Yeah, Jay just mentioned it, actually, that we don't see the word Muslim. That in that 60-year expanse between the time that Muhammad is supposed to have died and the reign of Abdul Malik as caliph, there is no mention of Muslims. They do not exist.
Right.
The word is never used. The people who come out and conquer are Tayyeye or Saracens or Hagarians. Then that
in reference to Hagar,
nothing...
right? In reference to Hagar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hagar and Ishmael.
Right.
But not
Ishmaelites.
There's no mention that this is a new religion and people who submit, who are called the submitters. They don't exist, and that's one of the most telling indications, because after all, we have to just think about what it would have been like if you live in a land that's conquered by these people. They're going to tell you what their name is, who they are, and you're going to ask them who they are, and they never say Muslims. This is, like I said before, it's much more than just an argument from silence.
Well, one last question again for you. I'm sorry, Robert. Somebody's asking how can they obtain an autographed copy of the book? Do you do that?
Well, it's going to be a while till there are any available, unfortunately, like I said, unless I can convince the publisher to move it up. But you can email me at director@jihadwatch.org. Probably better to do it if the book comes out in July. Probably better to do it in July, because now I will try to remember that and I'll forget in 6 months or 7 months, whatever it is. Write me then, and I will be happy to send you one.
Very good. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, brother. And then Jay is upset that he doesn't have an autographed copy from you, just to let you know.
You promise you'll send me
I
one?
need a copy of what Jay writes, but I guess I can't get autographs of videos is the problem.
Very good. Well, gentlemen, it's been a joy to have both of you. Thank you so much, really, for making time for us. I hope, Robert, that you can join me again and Jay in another live stream. I do this all the time. So maybe we can continue to unpack this very important topic. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for everyone who's been watching us. And we will continue to interact with your comments, of course, moving forward. This is Al Fadi, over and out. God bless.